Good morning, and today we're going to talk about the arts of ancient Egypt. But let's first start talking about the growth of the Egyptian civilization. So around 5000 BC, there were prehistoric hunters and their families that settled in the fertile valley of the Nile River. You can see on the map in the upper left-hand corner where we have Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. We're talking about the fertile valley around Lower Egypt. As far as experts can tell, these people came from Western Asia, but because there's no evidence that they moved on or died out, they're regarded as the direct ancestors of most of the Egyptian peoples. Now, the Nile River Valley in which they settled was about 750 miles long, but it measured no more than about 31 miles at its widest point. It was lined on both sides by cliffs ranging in height from around 300 to 100 feet, and beyond these cliffs was nothing but desert. So again, as you're looking where the old, middle, and new kingdoms are with Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, they didn't settle far away from the Nile River. There was lots of cliffs ranging in height from 300 to 1,000 feet, and right beyond those are going to be the deserts. So when we talk about the early inhabitants along the Nile, each summer the Nile River flooded its banks and deposited layers of fertile soil in the valley. Now, this soil had been carried for thousands of miles from the African interior. Now, in some places, the rich soil deposits reached a depth of more than 30 feet. Now, in this fertile environment, people gradually changed from food gatherers to food producers. Discovering that the wild vegetables and grains they gathered grew from seeds, these people also began to collect these seeds and planted them in that fertile soil of the valley. Although the people continued to hunt animals for food, they came to rely more and more on the animals that they raised themselves. This gave them an advantage over their ancestors. They were no longer entirely dependent on the game they hunted for survival. Because they did not have to move from one location to another in search of food, they began to build more permanent houses of mud, wood, and reeds. Now, this would lead to the formation of the earliest kingdoms. The settled existence brought about an increase in their population, and that would lead to the growth of villages, then towns. Some towns grew so large that they took control of neighboring villages and, in this way, formed a kingdom. As the prehistoric period came to a close, there were only two large kingdoms in Egypt. One of these was Lower Egypt, which included the fan-shaped delta region at the mouth of the Nile. The other was Upper Egypt, which was the valley that was carved in the desert by the river further south. Thus, an Egyptian civilization emerged along the banks of the Nile more than 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. It continued to exist for nearly another 3,000 years. Now, during that period, Egypt became a thriving nation in which a pharaoh or a ruler governed with complete authority. Agriculture and trade grew, art flourished, and majestic monuments and temples were constructed. When we take a look now at Egyptian history with both Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, those are our three major periods that we see the empires being built into. Now, each kingdom is further divided into dynasties. Now, a dynasty was a period during which a single family provided a succession of rulers. One reign ended with the death of a pharaoh, and another began with the crowning of their successor from the same royal family. Now, for this reason, every precaution was taken to keep the blood of the family pure. And one of these precautions was to forbid the pharaoh to marry outside of his immediate family. Starting with the Old Kingdom. Now, the earliest dynastic period began around 1100 BC, when Upper and Lower Egypt were united by a powerful pharaoh named Menes. Now, Menes established his capital at Memphis and founded the first of the 31 Egyptian dynasties. Now, the Old Kingdom dates from the start of the third of these dynasties in about 2686 BC. It also ended about 500 years later when the strong centralized government established by the pharaohs was weakened by the rise of a group of independent nobles. Now, these nobles split the country into smaller states. After that, civil war and disorder would soon break out between these states, and the authority of the reigning pharaoh collapsed. And you can see at the lower right, as we're going to be talking about some Egyptian arts, you have a carved image of King Narmer, also known as Menes. Now, after a long period of turmoil, the nobles in Thebes, a city on the upper Nile, were able to gain control of the country. They managed to unify Egypt once again into a single state, and order was restored to the troubled land. The success of these nobles marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a period of about 250 years from around 2050 to 1800 BC. The Middle Kingdom was a time of law and order and prosperity in Egypt. Now, this was true even though the pharaoh, while still the supreme head, was not as powerful as pharaohs had been during the Old Kingdom. Around 1800 BC, Egypt was overrun for the first time by foreign invaders. Using horses and chariots, the Hyksos from Western Asia swept across the country. They easily defeated the Egyptians who were fighting at that time on foot. Now, the Hyksos inhabited Lower Egypt and for 200 years forced the Egyptian people to pay them tribute. Finally, the Egyptians, having learned how to use the horses and chariots, drove the invaders from their country and restored their independence. Once the Egyptians did this, you're going to see the beginning of the New Kingdom. So the third and the most brilliant period of Egyptian history, which began in 1570 BC, is known as the New Kingdom or the Empire. Warrior pharaohs used their expertise with horses and chariots to extend Egypt's rule over now neighboring nations. Now, under one of these pharaohs, Amenhotep III, the New Kingdom reached the peak of its power and influence. Thebes, the royal capital, became the most magnificent city in the world. Suddenly, Amenhotep's son and heir, Amenhotep IV, broke with tradition. He tried to bring about changes in Egyptian religion that for centuries had recognized many different gods. Amenhotep IV also is going to move the capital from Thebes to Tel el Amarna. There he establishes Aten, symbolizing by the sun disk as the one supreme god. In honor of his god, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, which meant, "It is well with Aten." Unfortunately, while Akhenaten was absorbed in his new religion, Egypt's enemies began to whittle away pieces of the once mighty nation. So with Akhenaten's new religion, it does not survive after his death. Tel el Amarna was destroyed by Egypt's enemies, and the capital was returned to Thebes, with the old religion being restored. Although other pharaohs after Akhenaten tried to recapture the glories of the past, Egypt's long chapter in history was now coming to an end. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great of Macedonia conquered Egypt, bringing the New Kingdom to a close, and now several centuries of Hellenistic rule is about to follow. Finally, in 30 BC, Egypt was made a province of Rome. Now, the greatness of ancient Egypt has not been forgotten over the centuries. After all, works of art of all kinds remain. They range from huge pyramids and tombs to skillfully formed stone statues. There are also wall paintings and carved and painted reliefs. These and other treasures are fascinating reminders of the magnificent civilization that once flourished on the banks of the Nile. For example, we can see the golden throne of King Tut from around 1361 to 52, and its wood that is overlaid with gold, silver, and semi-precious stones. But let's take a look more closely at some of these pieces of art. For example, the pyramids. Try to picture the pyramids as they once were, covered with a smooth layer of polished white limestone. They're massive, pure white monuments that were standing against a backdrop of constantly shifting brown sand and blue sky. But what purpose did the pyramids serve, and how were they built? And again, what is inside? Well, you're looking at the Pyramid of Khufu, which is circa 2545 BC. So before you consider our questions, consider one example of these great monuments. This Pyramid of Khufu represents a rigid, straight contour line that clearly defines and accents the simple triangular shape of this monumental structure. Now, the Pyramid of Khufu is truly massive. It covers an area of almost 13 acres. This means that the 5 largest cathedrals in the world could be placed within its base, with room to spare. It was made by piling 2.3 million blocks of stone to a height of 480 feet. This makes the pyramid about as high as a modern 48-story building. Now, looking at it from the outside, you might expect the inside of the pyramid to be spacious, but this is not the case. Except for passageways and a few small rooms called galleries, The pyramid is completely made of solid limestone. So why build such a massive structure and then provide such little space inside? Well, to answer this question, you must first learn something about the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. As you'll see, religion influenced every phase of an Egyptian's life. Now, Egyptian religion placed great importance on the resurrection of the soul and the eternal life in a spirit world after death. The Egyptians believed that the soul, or Ka, came into being with the body and remained in the body until death. Now, at death, the Ka would leave the body for a time and eventually return and unite with the body again for the journey to the next world and immortality. Now, if the body were lost or destroyed, the Ka would be forced to spend eternity wandering aimlessly. For this reason, the Egyptians went to great lengths to preserve and protect the body after death. So following this complicated embalming process, the body was wrapped in strips of cloth and placed in a fortress-like tomb, where it would be safe until the Ka's return. Now, such a tomb served as a kind of insurance against a final death. Now, some of these most impressive tombs were built for the pharaohs. Each pharaoh was just more than a king. In the eyes of the people, he was a god. And when he died, the pharaoh was expected to join other gods, including Re, the sun god, Osiris, the god of the Nile and ruler of the underworld, and Isis, the great mother god. Each pyramid was built to house and protect the body of the pharaoh and the treasures he would take with him from this world to the next. Now, his body was sealed in a sarcophagus, a stone coffin. It was then placed in a burial chamber located in the center of the pyramid. Dead-end passages and false burial chambers were added to the building. These were meant to confuse tomb robbers and enemies who might try to destroy the pharaoh's body. So to an Egyptian, the destruction of the body was the most horrible form of vengeance. But the pyramid shape is going to develop gradually. Originally, the Egyptians buried their dead in hidden pits and piled sand and stone over the top of it. Now later this practice changed, and the Egyptians began to use sun-dried bricks to build mastabas. Now a mastaba is a low, flat tomb. These regular tombs had sloping sides and contained a chapel and a false burial chamber, in addition to the true one hidden deep inside. In time, several mastabas of diminishing size were stacked on top of each other to form a step pyramid. Finally, they were built without steps, and a point was added on the top, thus creating the true pyramid form. Now, thousands and thousands of workers toiled for decades to build a single pyramid. Limestone was quarried and dragged to the construction site and then carefully fitted into place. How the Egyptians managed to lift and fit these huge blocks of stone, each averaging about 2.5 tons, into place, today still remains unclear. But by the time of the Middle Kingdom, the weakened position of the pharaohs and the threat of invasion made construction of large-scale structures such as the pyramid impractical. Therefore, many smaller pyramids and mastabas may have been built during this period. However, these were probably made of mud bricks, which soon crumbled and disintegrated. Now, more permanent tombs prepared for the pharaoh were cut into the rock cliffs of a valley across the Nile from the capital city of Thebes. So the difference that we have between the original pyramids and the step pyramids, say perhaps a King Zoser that you see here, shows a little bit more of an impractical time period and how they're moving towards a more practical time. Now, if the pyramids are evidence of the skill of the Old Kingdom builders, then the great temples are the proof of the genius of the New Kingdom architects. Now, the practice of burying pharaohs and nobles in tombs hidden in the cliffs west of the Nile continued throughout the New Kingdom. Meanwhile, architects took on more important tasks. Temples were erected along the eastern banks of the river near Thebes, and these became more and more elaborate. Each of these temples was built by a command of a pharaoh and was dedicated to the pharaoh's favorite god or gods. When the pharaoh died, the temple became a funeral chapel where people brought offerings for the pharaoh's ka. For example, we have the Temple of Amman. The temple built to honor a particular god was often enlarged by several pharaohs until it reached tremendous proportions. Now, the ruins of the Temple of Amman at Karnak, dedicated to the all-powerful chief god of Thebes, will give you an idea of what these gigantic structures must have looked like. First, there's a wide avenue led directly to the front of the massive temple complex. And the great doorway was flanked by obelisks, tall, four-sided, pointed stone shafts. Next, statues of the pharaoh and huge banners opened into an uncovered courtyard. Now, entry to the great hall lies beyond the courtyard, and then massive stone columns reached a height of nearly 70 feet. Now, the sanctuary itself for the god was a small, dark, and mysterious chamber where only the pharaoh and certain priests were allowed to enter. As we continue looking at the art of ancient Egypt, why don't we look at their sculptures and paintings? Now, some of the most impressive achievements in the field of art were publicly visible pyramids and temples, but inside the pyramids and temples, however, are sculptures and paintings. And many of these treasures have survived over the centuries. For example, taking a look at the limestone canopic jars that you have in the lower left, or perhaps maybe one of the sculptures that have been painted on, like Hatshepsut, daughter of King Tutankhamun's portraits. And then we also have jewelry found in King Tutankhamun's tomb. But let's start with sculpture. Despite every precaution taken by the Egyptians, the fortress-like pyramids and tombs of the pharaohs were soon robbed of their treasures. Frequently, the mummified bodies of the pharaohs were mutilated or destroyed in the process. Now, to make certain that the Ka would still have a body to unite with, sculptors were ordered to carve the pharaoh's portrait out of hard stone. Now, these sculptures were placed in the tomb near the sarcophagus, where they acted as substitutes for the body inside. The Egyptians believed that even if the real body were destroyed, the Ka would be able to enter the stone substitute for the journey to the next world. So some of these other sculptures that we would have maybe would be the outer coffin of King Tutankhamun, and then even a second coffin for King Tut. With other sculptures that we have, some of them might be of a massive size, like the Great Sphinx. The strength and dignity that were a trademark of the pyramids also characterized the sculptures produced during the Old Kingdom. Perhaps most familiar and impressive example of the Old Kingdom sculpture is the Great Sphinx. Now, it's carved from rock at the site. The Sphinx presents the head of a pharaoh, probably the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafra, placed at the body of a reclining lion. It towers to a height of almost 65 feet. Now, in the seated portrait of Khafra, the figure has a solid block-like form of the hard diorite stone from which it was carved, and the pharaoh is shown sitting erect and attentive. Now, his body appears stiff and rigid, but the head has a more lifelike appearance. Other things that we might find on older sculptures as well might be cartouches. Now, early Egyptians used a form of picture writing to create a pictogram called a cartouche. These carved oval symbols represent the name of an important person. Next, let's look at symbolism in Egyptian art. So when we study Khafra's portrait, you may have the feeling that the pharaoh is aware of but above the concerns of ordinary mortals. He looks straight ahead, yet the eyes seem alive to events taking place around him. It is this quiet aloofness that makes this portrait a symbol of eternal strength and power befitting a king and a god. So look below at some of these different uses of symbolism that we might have, say perhaps in this sculpture. First, the pharaoh's throne is inscribed with symbols proclaiming him the king of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Next, his right hand forms a fist which must have once gripped some symbol of his high office. And then a falcon which represents Horus, the god of the sky, was placed behind Khafra's head to remind the viewers of the pharaoh's divinity. Khafra was considered to be a descendant of Ra, the sun god. Now, if we move to the Middle Kingdom, which lasted again around 2050 to 1800 BC, this was a time of law and order that ended when Egypt was invaded by the Hyksos. Much of the sculpture produced during this period was destroyed by the invading peoples and by the New Kingdom rulers who followed. Now, the works that survived have a wide range of quality. A fragment of the portrait of King Ciastris III is an example of the skill and sensitivity demonstrated by the best of the Middle Kingdom carvers. Now, the expression on this surprisingly realistic face suggests none of the confidence and aloofness noted in the portrait of Khafra. In this work, the firmly set mouth and the worry lines above the eyes convey a look that is troubled and weary. Now, the great Pharaoh Khafra never would have been portrayed with the expression seen on the sculpture of Ciastris III, but Khafra ruled during the Old Kingdom, which was a time when no one dared question the pharaoh's divine power or authority. Now, conditions had changed by the Middle Kingdom when this pharaoh's portrait was carved. The sculptor captured a look of concern and perhaps even resignation on the face of this ruler, whose authority depended largely on his personality, his strength, and his cleverness. And by about 1570 BC, all of the conquering Hyksos who had not been killed or enslaved had been driven out of the country. Egypt then entered a period of expansion and prosperity known as the New Kingdom. The Egyptians maintained their powerful army, which had been formed to defeat the Hyksos invaders, and they waged a series of successful raids, both to the east and to the west of Africa. Now, eventually, Egypt found itself in control of a vast territory. The expansion of the empire, which now extended from the upper Nile to the Euphrates River, brought new wealth to the country, and this wealth encourages artistic activity. During the New Kingdom, sculptors were commissioned to complete a variety of works. Now, these ranged from the huge tomb sculptures carved in the native rock to smaller pieces used to decorate temples. Statues of pharaohs were often gigantic, reaching heights of 90 feet. Some statues were painted and had eyes made from rock crystal, which heightened their realistic appearance. For example, the portrait of Akhenaten. During the New Kingdom, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, refused to follow the religious customs of his ancestors. Many of Akhenaten's portraits depict him realistically, with an elongated head, pointed chin, heavy lips, and a long, slender neck, and much of the art created during Akhenaten's reign also took on a more realistic look. Now, instead of the solemn, stiff likenesses favored by earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten's portraits are more natural and lifelike. They often show him in common, everyday scenes in which he is playing with his daughters or strolling with his wife, Nefertiti, who you also see on the right-hand side. Now, next in the New Kingdom, notice the unusual appearance of the figure of Methethe. His head, arms, legs, and feet are in profile, but his shoulders and eye are shown to be seen from the front. The man even appears to have 2 left feet, since there's a big toe on the outside of each foot. Furthermore, the figure seems to have been twisted in some way, making it look flat. Now, all parts of the body seem to be at the same distance from the viewer's eye. Did the artist who carved this panel simply lack the skill needed to make this portrait more lifelike? Well, a close examination of the figure reveals that this explanation is not reasonable. The head, for instance, is skillfully modeled and looks realistic. The body is correctly proportioned, and details on the other parts of the panel show the sculptor could carve realistically when he chose to. He also knew how to achieve effective design relationships. The detailed areas at the top and the left edge of the panel offer a pleasing contrast to the large area occupied by the figure of the man. So the limestone relief conforms to the rules of ancient Egyptian art. So when we look at this figure, we're supposed to see some familiarity and its appealingness, even despite the distortions that were required by the New Kingdom's art of the time. Now, when we look at the rules of Egyptian art, the carving's unusual features adhere to a strict set of rules followed by all Egyptian artists. These rules required that every part of the body be shown from the most familiar point of view. For this reason, the head, arms, legs, and feet were always shown in profile, whereas the eyes and shoulders were presented as seen from the front. Following these rules meant that paintings and relief sculptures of the body looked distorted and unnatural. It is a credit to the skill of Egyptian artists, however, that this distortion was kept to a minimum and did not detract from the appealing appearance of the works. Remember, the Egyptians were also greatly concerned about life after death. Paintings and relief sculptures of the dead were meant to serve as substitutes for the body. When artists created images of the pharaoh, they wanted to make sure that all parts of the body were clearly shown. This was more important to them than making the image beautiful or accurate. The complete image was vital. After all, if an arm was hidden behind the body in a relief sculpture or painting, it would mean that the ka would enter a body that was without an arm. It would then be forced to spend eternity in a deformed body. Thus, a strict set of rules was developed over the years to make sure that all parts of the body were shown, and shown correctly, in sculptured and painted images. Now, at one time it was customary for a pharaoh to have his wife, servants, and slaves sealed in the tomb with him when he died. Then, when he arrived in the next world, he would have his loved ones and servants with him for eternity. They would make sure that his new life would be just as pleasant as the old one. But in time, this practice of burying others with the pharaoh was discontinued. Instead, painted relief sculptures or sculptures in the round were substituted for the real people and placed in the tomb with the dead king. Now, eventually the tomb of every important or wealthy person was enriched with painted relief sculptures. When it became difficult and costly to carve reliefs on the rough, hard walls of the cliff tombs during the Middle Kingdom, painting came into its own as a separate art form. First, the walls of the cliff tombs were smoothed over with a coating of plaster, and when the plaster was dry, the artist went to work, drawing a series of horizontal straight lines on the plastered wall. Figures and animals were carefully arranged along these lines to tell a story, usually an event from the life of the deceased. The pictures were then colored with rich red and yellow hues, with black and blue-green added for contrast. Typically, little shading was used, so the figures tend to look flat, as if they'd been cut from paper and pasted on the wall. Now, this method of arranging pictures in horizontal bands and using bright colors with little shading resulted in a style similar to that of contemporary comic strips. So when we take a look inside a New Kingdom tomb prepared for a priest named Nakht, it will add to your understanding of Egyptian paintings. The portraits of Nakht and his wife are found on one wall of his tomb. They're surrounded by busy servants engaged in various hunting and fishing activities on the priest's land. The way in which the figures have been painted should look familiar. This artist, like the relief sculptor who created the portrait of Methethe, was bound by the standard rules of ancient Egyptian art. The figures of the priest and his wife are much larger than the other figures, to show that Nakht and his wife are more important. They're also stiff and solemn, because the Egyptians believed that such a pose was fitting for people of high rank. In contrast, the smaller servants are shown in more natural positions as they hunt and fish. So as you can see with the relief painting that we have on the right, we do have Nakht and his wife on the left being very much bigger and very much in a very composed position, where their servants in smaller relief are actually doing the work. Other things that we might see on these reliefs as well might be hieroglyphics. Now, under the border at the top of the painting are rows and columns of smaller birds and other shapes. These are Egyptian hieroglyphics, an early form of picture writing. These symbols, some of which represented objects, communicated information and were included in the wall paintings and other art forms to help tell the story. The signs were generally spaced to form attractive patterns, frequently clusters of squares or rectangles. Now, painted on another wall of the small chapel within Nakht's tomb is a false door. The priest's ka was expected to pass through this door in search of offerings. Arranged in bands on either side of the door are painted substitutes for servants bearing food and drink for the ka. Now, an assortment of offerings is painted in the section directly below the door, where the ka would be sure to find them when it entered. Egyptian artists were content to echo the art of the past until they encountered new ideas from outside sources, such as Greece and Rome. As the influence of these new ideas grew, Egyptian art lost much of its unique character, and Egyptian artists ceased to create the unique art of the pharaohs. And here's the picture of the false door. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn about the Egyptian arts. If you'd like to learn more about ancient Egyptian art, or maybe perhaps you'd like to learn about some of the history that goes along with this Egyptian art, please leave a comment down below and I'd be happy to create another slideshow. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by.